The old concert hall on Maple Street had seen better days. Its once bright red curtains were now faded to a dusty pink, and the golden paint on the ceiling was peeling in places. But if you looked closely, you could still see traces of its former glory. The intricate woodwork along the balconies, the crystal chandeliers that somehow still sparkled when the afternoon sun hit them just right, and the rows of velvet seats that had held thousands of people over the decades. These days, the building served as a community center. People came for town meetings, yoga classes, and the occasional birthday party rental. Nobody really thought much about what the place used to be. To most folks in Millbrook, it was just another old building that the town couldn't afford to fix up properly, but couldn't bear to tear down either. Thomas Bennett had been cleaning those floors for 15 years. Every evening at 6, he'd arrive with his cart full of supplies, his gray hair tucked under a baseball cap, and his shoulders slightly hunched from years of mopping and scrubbing. He was the kind of person you'd pass in the hallway without really seeing, not because he was unfriendly, but because he had that way of moving through spaces without drawing attention to himself. The people who used the building during the day barely noticed him. He'd empty trash cans while they argued about zoning laws, or wipe down tables while they rolled up their yoga mats. Sometimes someone would nod at him or say thanks, but mostly he was just part of the background. The janitor. The guy who made sure the lights were off and the doors were locked. Millbrook itself had changed a lot over the past 10 years. The textile mill that had employed half the town shut down, and when it did, it took more than jobs with it. It took the sense of purpose that had held the community together for 3 generations. The kids who grew up here started leaving for college and never coming back. The shops on Main Street began closing one by one. First the bookstore, then the toy shop, then even Joe's Diner, which everyone swore would outlast them all. What was left was a town that couldn't agree on anything. Some people wanted to sell off the old mill property to developers who promised to build condos and bring in new residents. Others fought against it, saying it would destroy the character of the place, turn it into just another cookie-cutter suburb. Town meetings turned into shouting matches. Neighbors who used to wave at each other from their front porches started avoiding eye contact at the grocery store. The Henderson family wasn't speaking to the Kowalskis because they were on opposite sides of the development debate. The church had split into 2 congregations over whether to support the new construction or preserve the historic downtown. Even the high school football team seemed less unified than it used to be. Like the tension in the town had seeped into everything. Thomas watched it all happen from the edges. He'd see the angry faces at town meetings, hear the bitter arguments echoing through the community center's halls. He'd clean up after these meetings, sweeping up crumpled papers and straightening chairs that had been shoved aside in frustration. Sometimes he'd find notes that people had written to each other, harsh words that they hadn't quite had the courage to say out loud. It made him sad, seeing his hometown tear itself apart like this. But what could he do? He was just the janitor. What nobody knew, what nobody could have guessed, was that Thomas Bennett had a secret. Every night after he finished his cleaning rounds, after the last person had left and the building was completely empty, he would do something that would have shocked every single person in Millbrook. He'd walk to a storage room at the back of the building, the one with the door that was always locked. He had the key, of course. Being the janitor meant having keys to everything. Inside that room, covered with a heavy canvas tarp and surrounded by old filing cabinets and broken chairs, was a Steinway grand piano. It had been there for decades, left over from when the building was an actual concert hall. Nobody had played it in years. Most people had probably forgotten it existed. The town had talked about selling it once but never got around to it. So there it sat, in the dark, waiting. Thomas would pull off the tarp carefully, the way you might uncover something precious. Then he'd unlock the wheels and slowly, quietly, roll the piano out of the storage room, down the hallway, and onto the stage of the main auditorium. It took him almost 20 minutes to do this every night, and another 20 to push it all back before he went home. But those hours in between, those were what he lived for. Under the dim stage lights that he'd switch on just bright enough to see the keys, Thomas would sit down at that piano and play. His weathered hands, the same ones that pushed mops and carried trash bags, would transform. They'd move across the keys with a grace and certainty that seemed impossible for a man who spent his days doing manual labor. He'd play Chopin and Beethoven, Mozart and Debussy. He'd play jazz standards and old folk songs. Sometimes he'd play pieces from memory, music he'd learned decades ago. Other times he'd improvise, letting his fingers find melodies that expressed things he could never put into words. The sound would fill the empty auditorium, bouncing off the walls and rising up to those peeling golden ceilings. If anyone had been there to hear it, they would have wondered how such beautiful music could exist in a town that felt so broken. But there was never anyone there. Just Thomas and the piano and the darkness beyond the stage lights. He'd been playing piano since he was 5 years old. His mother had been a piano teacher, and she'd recognized something in him early on. By the time he was 16, he was performing in competitions across the state. By 18, he'd been accepted to one of the best music conservatories in the country, with a full scholarship. That should have been the beginning of his story. Thomas Bennett, the concert pianist. Thomas Bennett, whose name would appear on programs at prestigious venues. Thomas Bennett, who would travel the world sharing his gift. But life had other plans. 2 weeks before he was supposed to leave for school, his father had a massive heart attack. He survived, but he couldn't work anymore. Thomas had a younger brother and sister, both still in high school. His mother's piano lessons brought in some money, but not nearly enough, so Thomas stayed. He got a job at the textile mill, working night shifts so he could help his brother and sister during the day. He told himself it was temporary, that he'd reapply to the conservatory in a year or two. But a year turned into 5, and 5 turned into 10. His siblings graduated and moved away. His father eventually passed. His mother died a few years later. By then, Thomas was in his 30s, and the dream of being a concert pianist felt like something from someone else's life. He was just a guy who worked at the mill and lived alone in his parents' old house. When the mill closed, he needed a job, and the town needed a janitor for the community center. It seemed like fate, in a way, coming back to the place where his mother used to take him to concerts when he was young. He told himself he'd made peace with how things turned out. He told himself that some dreams weren't meant to come true, and that was okay. But late at night, when his hands touched those piano keys and music filled the empty hall, he wondered if he'd been lying to himself all along. This was his secret. This was the part of himself he kept hidden, even from the few people in town who still remembered him as the talented kid who used to play. He couldn't bear for anyone to know. Couldn't bear the pity in their eyes, or worse, the disappointment. What would they think? That poor Thomas Bennett wasted all that talent to become a janitor. So he played in secret, and he cleaned in silence, and he watched his town fall apart around him, feeling helpless to do anything about any of it. But everything was about to change, because secrets, no matter how carefully you keep them, have a way of coming to light when you least expect it. It was a Tuesday night in late November, when everything started to unravel. The kind of cold that makes your bones ache, with wind that cuts right through your jacket no matter how many layers you're wearing. Most people in Millbrook were home by 8 o'clock, bundled up next to their heaters trying to forget about the town meeting earlier that evening. That meeting had been particularly brutal. The Pattersons and the Russos had gotten into a screaming match about the development proposal. Mrs. Chen had walked out in tears. Even the mayor looked exhausted, like he'd aged 10 years in the past few months. Thomas had stayed late cleaning up, sweeping up the scattered papers and wiping down the tables where people had slammed their fists in frustration. By 10:30, he thought everyone was gone. He'd checked all the rooms, turned off most of the lights, and was ready to begin his nightly ritual. He wheeled the piano out of storage, his muscles remembering the routine, even though his mind was elsewhere. Thinking about the angry faces he'd seen that evening. What Thomas didn't know was that somebody else was still in the building. Her name was Riley Patterson, and she was 17 years old. She'd come to the town meeting with her parents, watching from the back row as her mother and father positioned themselves on opposite sides of the room. Her mom sat with the people who wanted to sell the mill property and bring in new development. Her dad sat with those who wanted to keep things the way they'd always been. Riley had watched them avoid looking at each other the entire meeting. They'd driven there in separate cars. They'd probably drive home separately too. And once they got home, they'd either fight or give each other the silent treatment. Riley couldn't decide which was worse. So when the meeting ended and her parents got caught up in their respective groups, still arguing and making plans, Riley had slipped away. She'd found an unlocked classroom on the second floor and just sat there in the dark, trying to figure out when her family had fallen apart. trying to remember the last time her parents had smiled at each other, or the last time dinner hadn't been awkward and tense. She must have dozed off, because the next thing she knew, she was waking up to the sound of music. Not music from a radio or someone's phone. Real music. The kind that seemed to come from somewhere deep and genuine. Piano music that made something in her chest tighten and her eyes start to water before she even knew why. Riley followed the sound down the stairs, moving quietly, not sure what she was going to find. The main auditorium doors were slightly open, and warm light spilled out into the dark hallway. She could see through the gap, and what she saw made her freeze in place. There was the janitor, the old guy who was always pushing his cleaning cart around, sitting at a grand piano on the stage. But he looked completely different than he did during the day. His shoulders weren't hunched anymore. His hands moved across the keys like they were dancing, like they knew exactly where to go. And his face had this expression she'd never seen on any adult in Millbrook lately. He looked peaceful. He looked whole. The piece he was playing was beautiful and sad at the same time. It reminded Riley of everything she was feeling but couldn't express. The loneliness of watching her parents drift apart. The fear that her whole life was about to change. The weird guilt she felt, like somehow the problems in her family and in the town were her fault, even though she knew that didn't make sense. When the music stopped, Riley did something without thinking. She started clapping. Thomas spun around on the piano bench so fast he nearly fell off. His face went pale, then red, and Riley immediately felt terrible. She stepped into the auditorium, her hands up like she was approaching a frightened animal. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to scare you. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Thomas stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like he couldn't find words. Finally, he managed to say, "How long have you been here?" "Just for that last song. I was upstairs and I heard the music and I had to find out where it was coming from." Riley walked closer, her eyes moving between Thomas and the piano. "I didn't know there was a piano in this building. I didn't know you could play like that." "Nobody knows," Thomas said quietly. The words seemed to cost him something. "Nobody's supposed to know. Why not?" Riley asked, and she genuinely didn't understand. "If I could play like that, I'd want everyone to hear." Thomas looked down at his hands, still resting on the keys. "It's complicated." They sat in silence for a moment. Riley knew she should probably leave, let the old man have his privacy. But something made her stay. Maybe it was the music still echoing in her head. Maybe it was the fact that this was the first moment in weeks where she hadn't felt like her world was falling apart. "My parents are getting divorced," she heard herself say. "They haven't said it out loud yet, but I know. This whole thing with the town, the fighting about what to do with the mill property, it's just made everything worse. They can't agree on anything anymore. They can't even be in the same room without it turning into a fight." Thomas looked up at her and his eyes were kind. Not pitying, just understanding. "I'm sorry. That must be really hard." "The worst part is feeling like I don't have anywhere to go," Riley continued. She couldn't seem to stop talking now that she'd started. "Home doesn't feel like home anymore. School is full of people picking sides about the stupid development debate. Even my best friend's family isn't talking to my family because of this whole mess. Everything that used to feel solid just feels broken now." Thomas nodded slowly. Then he did something unexpected. He slid over on the piano bench and patted the space next to him. "Have you ever played?" Riley shook her head. "My mom wanted me to take lessons when I was little, but we never got around to it. Come here. I'll show you something simple." Riley sat down next to him, suddenly nervous. Up close, she could see how worn his hands were, calloused and scarred from years of hard work. But when he placed them on the keys again, they looked like they belonged there. "This is middle C," he said, pressing one key. "Everything else is built around this. All music, no matter how complicated it gets, comes back to these basic notes." He played a simple scale, his fingers moving up and down. "See? Nothing magical about it. Just patterns, just practice." He guided her hand to the keys and showed her how to play a basic melody. It was just 5 notes, repeated in a pattern. But when Riley played it herself, something inside her settled. It wasn't about being good at it. It was about having something to focus on besides everything falling apart around her. They spent the next hour like that. Thomas would play something, then break it down into pieces small enough for Riley to understand. He taught her a simple version of "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," and when she got it right, she felt more proud than she had about anything in months. "You were really good at this," Riley said eventually. "Like really, really good. Why did you stop? Why are you just the janitor here?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said, "Sometimes life takes you in directions you don't expect. My father got sick right when I was supposed to go to music school. My family needed me, so I stayed. And then time just kept passing, and this became my life." He ran his hand along the piano's edge. "I made my peace with it." "But you still play," Riley pointed out. "Every night alone." "That doesn't sound like peace. That sounds like grief." The words hung in the air between them. Thomas looked at her with something like surprise, as if this teenager had just articulated something he'd spent decades trying not to think about. "Maybe you're right," he said softly. Riley glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost midnight. Her parents were probably home by now, probably worried. Or maybe they were so caught up in their own drama that they hadn't noticed she wasn't there. She wasn't sure which possibility made her sadder. "Can I come back?" she asked. "Tomorrow night?" "I want to learn more." Thomas hesitated. She could see him weighing the risk, the possibility of his secret getting out. But then he nodded. "Okay, but Riley, you can't tell anyone about this." "About me playing, about the piano. Nobody can know? Why not?" she asked again. "Because," Thomas said, standing up from the bench, "some things are easier to keep locked away. Once you let them out, you can't control what happens next." Riley stood too, heading toward the exit. At the door, she turned back. "That song you were playing when I first heard you, what was it called?" "Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major," Thomas said. "It made me cry," Riley admitted. "But in a good way, like it understood something I couldn't explain." Thomas smiled, a real smile that made him look years younger. "That's what the best music does. It says the things we can't find words for." Riley walked home through the cold night, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel quite so alone. She had a secret now, a beautiful one. And tomorrow night, she'd go back to that empty auditorium and learn more about the language that needed no words. What she didn't know yet was that this was just the beginning, that secrets have a way of spreading, especially good ones, and that sometimes the thing you think you're hiding from the world is exactly what the world needs to see. Riley kept her promise. She came back the next night, and the night after that, and the night after that. Every evening around 11, she'd slip out of her house while her parents were in separate rooms avoiding each other, and make her way to the community center. Thomas would be waiting, the piano already set up on stage, warm light pooling around it like an island in the darkness. He taught her properly, the way he'd been taught as a child. Finger placement, posture, how to read sheet music. But he also taught her the things that couldn't be written down. How to feel the music instead of just playing the notes. How to let emotion guide your hands. How a single piece could sound completely different depending on what you were feeling when you played it. For Riley, those late-night lessons became the only stable thing in her life. Her parents had stopped pretending everything was fine. Her mom had started looking at apartments in the city. Her dad had moved into the spare bedroom. At school, kids whispered when she walked by because everyone in a small town knows when a family is falling apart. But at night, sitting next to Thomas at that piano, none of that mattered. There was just the music and the quiet understanding between them. He never pushed her to talk about her problems, but somehow playing the piano made her feel less alone with them. 3 weeks into their secret lessons, Riley made a mistake. She told her friend Kevin she hadn't meant to, but Kevin had noticed something was different about her. She seemed less tense, less angry at the world. One afternoon, sitting in the library pretending to study, he'd asked her directly what was going on, and Riley, tired of carrying the secret alone, told him everything. About finding Thomas playing the piano, about the late-night lessons, about how beautiful the music was and how it made her feel like maybe everything wasn't completely hopeless. Kevin listened with his eyes getting wider and wider. "Wait, Mr. Bennett? The janitor?"
He can play like actually play?
"Like a professional," Riley said. "Better than professional. I've looked up some of the pieces he plays on YouTube, and he's as good as anyone I've heard. Maybe better." Kevin was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then he said, "Can I come just once? I want to hear this." Riley hesitated. She'd promised Thomas that nobody would know. But Kevin wasn't just anyone. He was her oldest friend. the one person at school who hadn't treated her differently when her family started breaking down. And maybe, she thought, it would be good for Thomas to know that other people could appreciate what he did. "Okay," she said finally, "but you can't tell anyone, and you have to be respectful. This is really personal for him." That night, Riley brought Kevin to the community center. Thomas looked nervous when he saw the tall teenage boy standing next to Riley, but she quickly introduced them. "This is Kevin Park. He's my best friend. I trust him completely. He won't tell anyone." Kevin stepped forward, suddenly shy. "Mr. Bennett, I just wanted to say my grandfather talks about you sometimes. You used to work together at the mill. He said you were always the kindest guy there, even when things got hard." Thomas's expression softened. "Henry Park is your grandfather? How is he?" "He's okay. Arthritis is bad, and he's pretty bitter about how things turned out with the mill closing. But he's hanging in there." Kevin gestured toward the piano. "Riley said you play. Would you mind if I listened?" Thomas looked at Riley, who nodded encouragingly. Then he sighed and walked to the piano. "I suppose one more person can't hurt, but the same rules apply. This stays between us." What Thomas played that night was different from his usual repertoire. He played Georgia on My Mind and What a Wonderful World, old songs that Kevin's grandfather probably listened to. Songs full of nostalgia and longing and memories of better times. Kevin sat in the front row, completely still, his eyes fixed on Thomas's hands. When the music stopped, he was crying. Not sobbing, just silent tears running down his face. "My grandfather would love this," he said quietly. "He talks all the time about the old days, before the mill closed, before everyone got so angry at each other. This music sounds like how he talks about those times. Like something precious that got lost." Thomas nodded slowly. "That's exactly what it is." Kevin came back the next night. And the night after that. He didn't ask for lessons like Riley, he just wanted to listen. He'd sit in the audience while Thomas played and Riley practiced, and for a few hours, he'd forget about his own troubles. His family's hardware store was barely surviving, hanging on by a thread. His parents worked 16-hour days and still couldn't make ends meet. His older sister had dropped out of college because they couldn't afford tuition. But in that auditorium, listening to music that seemed to come from a better version of the world, Kevin could breathe. He could hope. The problem with secrets is that they rarely stay secret, especially among teenagers. Kevin mentioned the piano sessions to his girlfriend, Bethany Wong, swearing her to secrecy. But Bethany told her brother Tyler, who told his friend Danny Kowalski, who told his cousin Amy. Within 2 weeks, there were 7 teenagers showing up at the community center at 11 o'clock at night. Thomas was overwhelmed at first, almost panicked. This was supposed to be private, his quiet refuge from the world. But Riley convinced him to give it a chance to play for them once. So he did. And something unexpected happened. These kids, who came from families that weren't speaking to each other, who'd been taught to take sides in the town's bitter divide, sat together in that auditorium and just listened. Danny Kowalski's father was leading the charge to preserve the historic downtown. Amy's mother was the real estate agent working with the developers. Their families hated each other. But sitting in the dark, listening to Thomas play Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, none of that seemed to matter. The music created a space where the fighting couldn't reach them, where they didn't have to be on opposite sides of anything. They could just be kids who were tired of watching their town tear itself apart. Thomas started taking requests. Bethany loved jazz, so he played Duke Ellington and Miles Davis. Danny was into old rock songs, so Thomas showed him how the Beatles' Let It Be sounded on classical piano. Tyler wanted to hear movie soundtracks, and Thomas played themes from films the boy had grown up watching. But he also started playing his own compositions, pieces he'd written over the years and never shown anyone. He'd been composing music about Millbrook for decades, storing the sheet music in the filing cabinet in the storage room. Songs about the mill, about Main Street, about the river that ran through town. Music that captured what the place used to be and what it had become. He played a piece called Morning Shift that mimicked the rhythm of the old mill machinery, steady and strong. He played Sunday in the Square, that sounded like church bells and children laughing and neighbors greeting each other. He played Empty Windows that was haunting and lonely, capturing the feeling of walking down Main Street and seeing all those closed storefronts. The teenagers listened to it all, and they understood. This music was about their home, their history, their loss. Thomas had taken all the complicated feelings they had about Millbrook, and turned them into something beautiful. One night, after Thomas finished playing a particularly moving piece about the river, Riley spoke up. "Mr. Bennett, why are you hiding this? The whole town needs to hear what you're doing." Thomas shook his head immediately. "No, absolutely not. This is private, but why?" Kevin asked. "This could help people. It could remind them of what they're fighting for or what they're losing or something. I don't know exactly, but I know it matters." "You don't understand," Thomas said, his voice tight. "I'm not a concert pianist. I'm a janitor. I'm the guy who never lived up to his potential, who stayed in this town and pushed a mop for 40 years. If people found out I'd been playing piano in secret all this time, they'd pity me, or worse, they'd laugh." "Nobody would laugh," Bethany said firmly. "What you do is incredible." But Thomas was already wheeling the piano back toward the storage room, his jaw set, his shoulders tense. The conversation was over. The teenagers left that night feeling frustrated. They discovered something precious, something that made them feel connected to their town and to each other in a way nothing else did. And it was going to stay locked away because Thomas was too afraid of being seen. Riley walked home slowly, thinking hard. Her phone buzzed with texts from the others. They were all saying the same thing. Somebody had to convince Thomas to go public. Somebody had to make him see that his gift wasn't just for him. It was for all of them. But how do you convince someone to face their deepest fear? How do you tell someone that the thing they're most ashamed of might be exactly what everyone needs? Riley didn't have the answer yet. But she knew one thing for certain. This secret couldn't stay hidden forever. One way or another, the truth was going to come out. And when it did, Millbrook would never be the same. The night everything changed started like any other winter evening in Millbrook. Cold, dark, and full of tension. The town council had called an emergency meeting to vote on the development proposal once and for all. After months of fighting, delays, and community forums that went nowhere, they were finally going to make a decision. Sell the mill property and the surrounding land, including the old community center, or find another way forward that nobody had figured out yet. The auditorium was packed tighter than it had been in years. Every seat was filled and people lined the walls. The Henderson family sat on one side. The Russos sat on the other. The Pattersons came in separate cars and sat in different sections. You could feel the division in the room like a physical thing, heavy and suffocating. Riley sat in the back with Kevin. Bethany, Tyler, Danny, and Amy. They'd all come together, which raised a few eyebrows since their families were supposed to be enemies. But nobody said anything. Everyone was too focused on the vote that was about to happen. Thomas wasn't at the meeting. He never came to these things anymore. They were too painful to watch. Instead, he was doing what he always did, waiting for everyone to leave so he could clean up and then play his piano in peace. He'd arrived at 6 as usual, started preparing his supplies, checking which rooms would need attention after the meeting ended. But then something went wrong. Really wrong. The heating system in the community center was old, probably should have been replaced a decade ago. The town kept patching it, fixing little problems here and there, but never addressing the real issues because that would cost money they didn't have. That night, in the middle of the meeting, a pipe burst in the basement. Water started flooding the mechanical room, and within minutes the whole heating system shut down. The temperature in the building dropped fast. You could see people's breath within 20 minutes. The mayor tried to continue the meeting, but people were shivering, wrapping their coats tighter, complaining. They decided to move everything to the high school gymnasium, which had better heating. In the chaos of everyone grabbing their things and rushing out to their cars, nobody thought to tell Thomas what was happening. He was in a supply closet on the 3rd floor when the evacuation started, restocking paper towels, his headphones in, listening to a recording of Glenn Gould playing Bach. By the time he came back downstairs, the building was empty. Or at least he thought it was empty. He did his usual check of all the rooms, found them deserted, and figured the meeting had ended early. Maybe they'd finally reached a decision. Maybe the fighting was over, for better or worse. He went about his routine, cleaning the auditorium where the meeting had been held. Papers were scattered everywhere, chairs pushed back in angry gestures, someone's coffee cup abandoned on a table. The usual aftermath of a Millbrook town meeting. What Thomas didn't know was that someone else was still in the building. Margaret Foster, the town council president, had come back. She'd left her reading glasses in the meeting room and needed them to see properly at the relocated meeting. She was 72 years old and had lived in Millbrook her entire life. She'd gone to school with Thomas, actually. They'd been in the same graduating class back in 1971. Margaret remembered when Thomas used to play piano at school assemblies. She remembered the announcement that he'd gotten accepted to that fancy music school in Boston. She even remembered feeling a little sad when she heard he hadn't gone, that his father's illness had kept him home, but that was more than 50 years ago, and she hadn't thought about it in decades. She came back into the building through the side door, shivering from the cold, and headed straight for the auditorium. But when she got there, she heard something that made her stop in her tracks. Music, piano music, echoing through the empty building. At first, she thought maybe someone had left a radio on, but no, this was live music. Someone was actually playing. She followed the sound, her footsteps quiet on the old wooden floors. The storage room door was open, which was unusual. Margaret had been on the town council for 20 years, and she'd never seen inside that storage room. It was always locked, and honestly, she'd forgotten what was even in there. But the door was wide open now, and the canvas tarp that usually covered something large was pulled back and draped over some filing cabinets. The piano. There was a piano in there, a beautiful grand piano that must have been there since the building's days as a real concert hall. Margaret stared at it, stunned. She'd been voting on budgets for this building for 2 decades, and nobody had ever mentioned there was a Steinway grand piano in storage. But that wasn't the most shocking part. The shocking part was seeing Thomas Bennett sitting at that piano, playing it like his life depended on it. Margaret stood in the doorway, her lost reading glasses completely forgotten, watching the Janitor play Rachmaninoff. She recognized the piece because her late husband had loved it, used to play it on their old record player on Sunday mornings. Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most technically difficult pieces ever written, and Thomas was playing it perfectly, not just hitting the right notes, but playing it with feeling, with depth, with an understanding of the music that took decades to develop. His eyes were closed, his whole body moving with the melody, and he looked nothing like the quiet janitor who shuffled through the building emptying trash cans. He looked like what he was supposed to be, what he'd been meant to be all along. When the piece ended, Margaret did something without thinking. She stepped into the room and her shoe scraped against the floor. Thomas's eyes flew open and he spun around on the bench, his face going white when he saw her standing there. "Margaret," he said, his voice barely a whisper. They stared at each other for a long moment. Thomas looked terrified, like he'd been caught doing something shameful. Margaret felt her eyes filling with tears, though she couldn't have explained exactly why. "How long?" she asked finally. "How long have you been doing this?" Thomas stood up from the bench, his hands shaking slightly. 15 years. Every night. I didn't think anyone would ever know. Thomas Bennett, Margaret said, and her voice cracked. All this time. All these years. She walked into the room, moving past him to look at the piano. There were papers scattered on top of it, sheet music covered in handwritten notes. She picked up one page and read the title, Millbrook Suite Movement One Morning at the Mill. "You've been composing," she said. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded miserably. "It's just something I do. It doesn't mean anything." "Doesn't mean anything?" Margaret looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Thomas, do you know how many people in this town would give anything to have a gift like this?" "Do you know what this could mean?" "It means I'm a 65-year-old janitor who wasted his life," Thomas said bitterly. "It means I'm the guy who had potential and threw it away." "I know what people would say, Margaret. I know what they'd think." Margaret set down the sheet music and walked over to him. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she looked at Thomas with an intensity that made him take a step back. "I'll tell you what I think," she said. "I think you've been breaking my heart for 50 years and I didn't even know it. I think you're the most talented person this town has ever produced, and you've been hiding it like it's something to be ashamed of. And I think that if anyone in Millbrook heard what I just heard, they wouldn't pity you. They'd weep." Thomas shook his head. "You don't understand." "No, you don't understand," Margaret said firmly. "This town is falling apart, Thomas. We're out there voting on whether to sell our history because we can't figure out any other way forward. Families aren't speaking to each other. Neighbors hate each other. We've forgotten who we are and what we're supposed to be fighting for." She picked up the sheet music again, holding it up. "But this remembers. This music you've written, it's about us, about who we used to be. And maybe, just maybe, it could help us remember why any of this matters." "I can't," Thomas said. "I can't perform in front of people. I can't handle them knowing. Margaret was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she said, "The vote is happening right now. At the high school. We had to move because the heating broke. If we sell that property, this building goes with it. That piano, your music, all of it, gone." Thomas felt something twist in his chest. He'd known the vote was coming, but hearing it like this, so immediate and final, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "What do you want me to do?" he asked quietly. "I want you to play," Margaret said. "Tomorrow night. At the next council meeting. Before the final paperwork gets signed. I want you to show this town what they're losing. Not just the building, but the heart of who we are." "They'll laugh at me," Thomas said. "They won't," Margaret promised. "And if they do, I'll personally kick them out of the meeting." "Thomas, please. I'm not asking for me. I'm asking for Millbrook." Thomas looked at the piano, at the sheet music he'd been writing for years, at the woman who'd been his classmate half a century ago. He thought about Riley and Kevin and all those other kids who'd been coming to hear him play. Kids from families that hated each other, sitting together in the dark, united by music. Maybe Margaret was right. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. "Okay," he said finally, his voice shaking. "I'll do it. But I'm going to need help." Margaret smiled, and for the first time in months it was a smile full of hope. "Leave that to me." What neither of them knew was that Riley and the others were already planning something. That the teenagers who'd been keeping Thomas's secret had decided it was time to stop keeping it. That everything was about to come together in a way nobody could have predicted. Sometimes the thing you're most afraid of is exactly what needs to happen. Sometimes the secret you've been hiding is the answer everyone's been looking for. And sometimes a small town needs to be reminded that the most valuable things aren't the ones you can sell, but the ones that sing. The next evening, word spread through Millbrook that there would be a special presentation before the final signing of the development contract. Margaret Foster had personally called every council member, every family that had been at the meetings, every business owner who still had a shop on Main Street. She didn't tell them what the presentation was about. She just said it was important, that it might change how they saw everything, and that they needed to be there. People came out of curiosity more than anything else. The auditorium filled up again, the same divided crowd, the same tension in the air. The Hendersons on one side, the Russos on the other, parents who'd stopped speaking to each other, neighbors who'd become strangers. Riley and her friends sat together in the middle section, their hearts pounding. They knew what was about to happen. Margaret had called Riley that morning, told her the whole story about finding Thomas at the piano. She'd asked Riley to bring the other teenagers, to sit where Thomas could see them when he looked out at the crowd. Friendly faces to anchor him when the fear threatened to take over. Thomas stood backstage wearing the same clothes he always wore. Jeans, a flannel shirt, his old work boots. He'd thought about dressing up, maybe wearing the suit he kept in his closet for funerals, but Margaret had talked him out of it. "Be who you are," she'd said. "They need to see the real you." His hands were shaking so badly he had to clasp them together. He could hear the crowd on the other side of the curtain, the low murmur of confused voices wondering what this was all about. In 65 years, he'd never been this terrified. Not when his father had the heart attack. Not when the mill closed. Not even when his mother died. This was different. This was choosing to be seen, really seen, after spending half a lifetime invisible. Margaret walked onto the stage and the crowd gradually quieted down. She stood at the podium looking out at all these people she'd known her whole life. Some of them she'd gone to school with. Some of them she'd watched grow up. All of them hurting in one way or another. "I know you're all wondering why I asked you here tonight," she began. "The vote happened. The contract is drawn up. Tomorrow morning we're supposed to sign the papers that will sell the mill property and this building to Bennett Development Corporation." There was a murmur through the crowd. Some people nodded, resigned. Others looked angry, defeated. "But before we do that," Margaret continued, "I want you to hear something. Last night I discovered something I should have known about years ago. Something that's been happening in this building every single night for the past 15 years. Something that reminded me why this place matters, why this town matters, and why maybe we've been asking ourselves the wrong questions all along." She gestured toward the side of the stage. "Thomas, would you come out here, please?" Thomas walked onto the stage, and you could feel the confusion ripple through the audience. The janitor? What did the janitor have to do with anything? Riley's father actually laughed, thinking it was some kind of joke. But then the curtain behind Thomas rose, and there was the piano. The Steinway grand that nobody knew existed, polished and gleaming under the stage lights. Thomas walked to it without looking at the crowd because if he looked at them, he'd lose his courage entirely. He sat down at the bench, his hands hovering over the keys. For a moment, he couldn't do it. Couldn't make himself play. The silence stretched out, awkward and uncomfortable. Someone coughed. Someone else whispered something. Then Riley stood up in the audience. Just stood there looking at him. And then Kevin stood up next to her. Then Bethany. Then Tyler and Danny and Amy. All 7 teenagers standing in solidarity, telling him without words that he wasn't alone. Thomas took a deep breath and began to play. The first notes of Millbrook's suite filled the auditorium, and the room went absolutely still. It started quietly, tentatively, like the town waking up on a morning long ago. Then the melody grew stronger and you could hear it. The rhythm of the old mill machinery, steady and powerful. The left hand pounded like pistons while the right hand sang like workers' voices raised in conversation and laughter. People in the audience sat up straighter. Some of them had worked at that mill. They recognized the rhythm, felt it in their bones. Mrs. Patterson started crying, remembering her father who'd spent 40 years on the factory floor. The second movement shifted into something lighter, brighter. Sunday in the Square, Thomas had called it. The music danced and played, capturing the feeling of the town on weekend afternoons when families would gather in the park. You could almost hear children laughing, could almost see the ice cream truck making its rounds, could almost feel the sun warm on your face. The Henderson family sat together, and for the first time in months, Mr. Henderson reached over and took his wife's hand. She didn't pull away. The third movement was different, slower, minor key, full of spaces where notes should have been. Empty windows, the piece that Thomas had written about Main Street dying. Each note sounded like a door closing, a light going out, a dream ending. It hurt to listen to, but it was honest. It was true. People looked down at their hands, at their laps, anywhere but at each other. Because this music was holding up a mirror, showing them what they'd let happen to their home. The fourth movement was the hardest to listen to. Divided hearts. The 2 hands on the piano played against each other, fighting, never quite finding harmony. It was discordant and angry and sad all at once. It was every argument at every town meeting. It was families splitting apart. It was neighbors becoming enemies. Riley watched her parents sitting on opposite sides of the auditorium. Her mother was crying. Her father had his head in his hands. Then came the fifth movement, and everything changed. It started with just one note, quiet and uncertain. Then another note joined it, then another. Slowly, carefully, the melody began to build. The 2 hands that had been fighting started to work together, finding common ground. The rhythm of the mill came back, but softer now, transformed into something new. The children's laughter returned. Even the sad notes from the empty windows found a place in the harmony. It wasn't about going back to the way things were. It was about taking all the broken pieces, all the pain and loss and anger, and building something new from them, something that honored the past while moving toward the future. The music swelled, filling every corner of the auditorium, and it was so beautiful that people couldn't hold back anymore. They cried openly. They reached for each other's hands. The Russos and the Hendersons looked at each other across the aisle and saw not enemies, but neighbors who were hurting just as much as they were. When the final chord faded away, nobody moved, nobody breathed. The silence was sacred, holy almost. Then Riley started clapping and everyone else joined in. They stood up, all of them, every single person in that auditorium. They applauded until their hands hurt, and some of them were still crying, and Thomas sat at the piano with tears running down his face too, overwhelmed by the response. Margaret walked back to the podium. "This is Thomas Bennett," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He's been our janitor for 15 years. Before that, he worked at the mill for 30 years. He gave up a scholarship to a prestigious music conservatory to take care of his family when his father got sick. He spent his entire life serving this community, and every night after we all go home, he comes here and plays this piano and writes music about us. About Millbrook, about who we are." She held up the sheet music. "This is our story, our real story. Not the one about development deals or property values or progress versus preservation. This is about people who built something together, who lost their way and who might still find it again if we remember what we're really fighting for." The mayor stood up. The vote still happened. The contract is still on the table. I know, Margaret said, but maybe we were asking the wrong question. Maybe instead of selling everything or keeping everything exactly the same, we need to find a third option, one that honors where we've been while creating space for where we need to go. Over the next 3 hours, something happened that nobody expected. People started talking, really talking, not shouting over each other. The developers were called back to the table. Compromises were suggested. What if they could preserve the community center and some of the historic buildings, while still allowing new development on part of the mill property? What if the new construction had to meet certain architectural standards that fit with the town's character? What if some of the new revenue went into a fund for supporting local businesses? It wasn't perfect. It wasn't everything everyone wanted. But it was something they could all live with. A solution that nobody had been able to see before because they'd been too busy fighting to listen. Riley's parents found each other in the crowd after the meeting ended. They didn't hug, didn't make grand declarations, but they stood next to each other and talked quietly. It was a start. Thomas was surrounded by people wanting to thank him, to shake his hand, to tell him how the music had moved them. Henry Park, Kevin's grandfather, pushed through the crowd with tears on his weathered face. "Tommy," he said, using the nickname from 50 years ago, "I always knew you had something special. I'm just glad the rest of them finally got to see it too." 3 months later, the community center reopened with a new name, the Bennett Community Arts Center. Thomas retired from janitorial work and became the music director, teaching piano to anyone who wanted to learn. The teenagers who'd kept his secret became his first official students. The development deal went through, but on terms the town could accept. New apartments and shops were built on part of the mill property, bringing in young families and new energy, but the historic district was preserved, and several old buildings were restored, including the hardware store that Henry Park's family had owned. Riley's parents didn't get back together, but they learned to be civil, to put Riley first, to remember that they'd loved each other once, even if that chapter was over. Riley started composing her own music, pieces about divorce and healing and finding yourself when everything falls apart. On Friday nights, the Arts Center hosted concerts that were open to everyone. Thomas would play, and sometimes his students would perform. And the auditorium that had once echoed with angry voices now filled with music and with people who'd remembered how to see each other as neighbors again. Thomas never did become a famous concert pianist. He never played in the great halls of Europe or made recordings that won awards. But every Friday night he played for the people of Millbrook, and they listened with grateful hearts. And sometimes, late at night when everyone had gone home, he'd sit at that piano alone and play for himself, for the young man he'd been who'd thought he'd failed, for all the years he'd spent hiding. But he wasn't hiding anymore, and in the end that made all the difference.